If you're looking to connect with the top minds in learning and talent, there's no better place than an iVentiv event. That's IVENTIV. Since 2009, they've hosted nearly 300 interactive conversational events exclusively for senior leaders like global heads of learning. I've been a sponsor myself and found these events invaluable. Less about sitting and listening, more about real, impactful conversations. It's an unmatched opportunity to collaborate with leading chief learning officers on the challenges they're tackling today. Join the conversation. Visit iventiv.com/learninghack. That's iventiv.com/learninghack. What is workplace learning for? It's easy to answer, isn't it? We need L&D to teach our people the stuff we hired them to do that they're too incompetent or ignorant to perform.
Hold on a minute there, John. Research shows that 98% of performance gaps are caused by organisational barriers, not knowledge deficits.
Oh, so to get L&D right, you have to take a wider, more strategic focus? But who actually does that? Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
And knowledge is power.
Knowledge. Education.
My guest this time has spent a lifetime trying to get learning professionals of all stripes to take a wider, more systemic view of how learning functions within organisations. But has he got anywhere with it? He'll be a familiar name to you and is a previous guest on this podcast too, so a friend of the podcast as well. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of FACT. Give us his vital statistics.
Hack Facts.
Charles Jennings is Managing Director of Dunn Troon Consultants and partner at the 70-20-10 Institute. With over 40 years of experience in learning and performance improvement, Charles has been a pivotal figure in transforming corporate learning strategies. He previously served as Chief Learning Officer at Thomson Reuters, where he developed innovative learning solutions for a global workforce. Charles is renowned for advocating the 70-20-10 framework, which emphasises learning from experience and collaboration. His expertise spans various sectors, making him a leading voice in the evolution of workplace learning and performance enhancement.
Charles has been a lifelong rebel against L&D complacency, and it's made him a voice that people listen to. When you've been an agent of change for that long, you want to know that your ideas have had some effect. But have they? Charles, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Welcome to The Learning Hack.
Well, it's a real pleasure to catch up and talk again, John.
Yeah. We last spoke in 2021, 3 years ago, and listening back to that episode in preparation for this conversation, I think I noticed something about you. What I saw was a restless intelligence, someone who finds the box into which learning is put as much too confining, someone who wants to use ideas and models like 70-20-10 and new technologies as crowbars to pull that box apart at the seams. Do you think that's a fair comment?
A restless intelligence, that's a rather generous description, John. I'm certainly someone who's never seen any great value in swimming with the tide, to be honest. I've always assumed that my early years and various 1960s campaigns I was involved in, showing my age, I was drafted to fight in Vietnam, but it was a conscientious objector, and I was involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I was also involved in various nefarious sort of anti-apartheid activities during the 60s. And I think they all gave me some sort of training in challenging current thinking and practices. Plus, I guess my university experiences, first of all in applied sciences and chemical engineering, and I only came to adult learning in postgraduate studies much later on. I guess all of those sort of embedded some form of healthy skepticism and desire to push the envelope a bit. And in L&D, I think, is a profession which, rather surprisingly, doesn't have a great track record in being at the forefront of change. L&D offers some sort of rich pickings for people like me. And with that said, I certainly feel part of the learning and performance professions, and I've just tried to push to improve traditional approaches over the years. And there's a lot of work for all of us to do if we're going to deliver on that promise.
Yeah, I think you've given some good arguments there for the value of the boomer generation, so to speak. We get a lot of stick nowadays, us boomers,
We certainly
Charles.
do. Yes, we certainly
So,
do.
especially from our kids.
Yeah.
And probably get it from grandchildren as well. But, I think there's a value there in questioning authority and received ideas and so on. I really would recommend people to listen to the previous episode we did with you for a kind of later phase of your career there, how you got into learning technologies. Because that's absolutely fascinating, that kind of mix of academia, government-sponsored initiatives, and then entrepreneurial startups and so on, where you started. But to bring us up to date, do you think generative AI, the latest shiny new thing in learning technologies, I know it's a lot more than that, but it's occupying that place of shiny new thing for a lot of people at the moment. Do you think that's a useful crowbar for getting us out of the box, or is it more likely to entrench us in some bad habits?
Yeah, very, very interesting question, and at the top of a lot of people's minds at the moment, John. Generative AI and AI overall, I think, offers huge potentials for L&D. We're already starting to see some game-changing uses in terms of digital assistance and other sort of performance support applications. But what really worries me is what I'd call the faster horses or faster courses syndrome. And, there's no record of Henry Ford ever making that famous quote, if I'd asked them, they would have wanted faster horses.
Yeah.
But I'm concerned that really much of the sort of rush to deploy AI and L&D is all around faster courses. It's around almost every day we see some company or another offering AI-assisted or AI-driven rapid content development or other sorts of content-centric aspects of AI. And I think we've seen, to be honest, enough, content-rich, experience-poor learning solutions to know that probably that's not the best use of a really powerful technology such as AI. And if I might make another observation about generative AI, which I think is important, but I haven't really heard it discussed widely or really much at all in L&D circles. And it's this: generative AI by its nature is really a next word guessing engine. It draws on an existing corpus of data and information and then generates something meaningful and makes sense, we hope. And that's great in situations where we're looking for some sort of innovative ideas and solutions. And currently, I think Gen A does this pretty well. It can support innovation, it can build on existing knowledge. However, we really need invention to create new things, new stuff, whether it's new approaches, new products, new techniques, whatever. And the sort of the 21st century equivalents of discovering penicillin or inventing the light bulb or the steam engine or something like that. And invention is really still in the domain of humans and not in AI. That inventive step, which requires really a creative conception, the aha moment, is still presents a real challenge for technology. So I see AI as an extremely useful crowbar, if used well, and one which L&D had better get to grips with, or it's going to eat our lunch and take our jobs. But there's still areas where, human invention, human approaches are really, really required. So, just thinking that AI is going to take over everything we do is, at the moment, certainly, not on the cards as far as I can see.
So talking about that thing we see at the moment, that use of generative AI is stuck a bit in faster content production. Egil Vinauskaite, who's a friend of the podcast, showed some interesting stats at Learning Technologies this year from her research, which seemed to indicate that the way to get out of that trap and into more sophisticated uses of AI for kind of coaching, personalization, and other fancy stuff was going to need other sources within the organization to help, because, you know, for instance, using a co-pilot isn't necessarily an L&D decision. So as L&D tries to make better use of AI, it will need to draw on other resources from the rest of the organization. That feels to me very much like your bailiwick in terms of talking about how L&D lives within the organization, within or outside HR, and so on. Do you have a comment about that?
Yes, it does. I think that's absolutely right. What you said around the fact that L&D needs to step out of its box and think about working with other parts of the organization, because we don't exist. In fact, one of the bugbears I've had over the years is when learning and development people talk about us and the organization as being almost as if they're separate entities. Whereas you don't hear a marketing executive talk about marketing and the organization as being separate entities or any other part of organizations. And so I think that really does require that rethink of what we do and what's part of our bailiwick, as you say. And I've always felt that L&D is partly to blame itself, because we've focused ourselves down on building individual knowledge and skills. And that seems to be the core of what L&D thinks it should do. Whereas if we flip it and think about, well, actually our job is to help our organization, teams within the organization, and individuals within those teams deliver the best they can in aligned with the purpose of the organization. That's what we're about. And once you start thinking from that perspective, it immediately raises the question of, well, I can't just sit here and churn out content and throw it out in various formats and hope that it sticks and has an impact. And you need to think about it in a whole different way. And that means taking a holistic approach, thinking about how we work closely with the people who are doing the work and the people who are responsible for those doing their work, and to understand, you know, that difference between competence and expertise, which is a big leap, really. You know, organizations don't just want a group of competent people, they want high levels of expertise, and you don't get that expertise from simply following e-learning and following a learning path and, you know, the standard sort of formal learning. You get it from a whole range of other things.
I'd like to talk a bit more about that individual versus the team kind of thing a bit later, perhaps. But something else that you mentioned in there I'd like to ask about is something that's become really popular as a talking point in the 3 years since we spoke, which is the focus on skills. I mean, I know people talked a lot about it before, but it seemed to ramp up, particularly as something we can throw technology solutions at. You know, we have skills graphs, skills engines, all types of learning systems features built around taxonomies for skills and so on. Is this a useful thing in getting us away from what you describe as the schooling mindset, do you think? How do you feel? There's a lot of skepticism now about the whole skills obsession. What do you think?
Yeah, the skills obsession. Yes, absolutely. I wrote a discussion paper with David Broadhurst a couple of years ago titled Beyond the Skills Obsession. Don't get me wrong, I think skills are really important, but maybe skills are not as important as those of us in learning, talent and HR really think they are. And I've often reflected on this and reflected on the obsession of things such as job taxonomies. And 20 years ago or more, every HR department in every organization across the world were tied up in categorizing job families and job roles and then assigning skills to them, and whether they were professional skills or general skills, and then putting them at various levels of basic awareness, working knowledge, fully competent expert, or whatever you call it, whatever taxonomy you had. And the big consulting companies had a huge amount of work on their hands with this, just as they have a lot of work today in skills mapping. And I don't really have an issue with all this skills work, but I think we need to put it into context. Of course, we need to have a focus on skills. But there are other more important factors than skills which create high-performing organizations. And much of L&D seems to ignore that fact. And to your point, a lot of work on skills development is built around formal learning, this schooling mindset. And the idea that we can build a curriculum that's usually a content-rich curriculum, and then plug people into the curriculum or into learning pathways and assume that through this schooling approach we're going to build high levels of expertise and drive excellence is really, to be honest, it's just cloud cuckoo land. I've never seen an expert emerge from a skills-based training course, and I challenge you or anyone really to prove that wrong, because expertise doesn't develop from that e-learning program or that course that I've run. That may help the process, but that isn't the be all and end all. Formal learning may get people started. It may develop some levels of competence, but expertise is built in all sorts of other ways. Lots of experience doing stuff, having an expert at hand, or help to discuss why something didn't turn out the way you expected it, and being part of your profession or your trade where you share experiences and stories. And I always go back to Jerome Brunner, the great educational psychologist, who, in his term, he talked about becoming inculcated into the practice of the profession. And that's the difference between competence and expertise. And I see that the skills piece is important in terms of developing that basic competence, maybe. But when we look to developing real high performance, we need to focus beyond that. So an obsession with skills really is going to continue to sort of keep us in that box of traditional formal learning, building competence, having our competence frameworks and so on. And as I say, I'm not dissing those. I'm not saying they're not important, but they are certainly not the whole picture.
Something you said there that really resonates with me. Earlier in the year, I saw a presentation, and for reasons that become obvious, I'm not going to mention who the vendor was or who the client was. But the vendor in this case had done a huge skill mapping exercise for all the jobs in the client's organization. And as they kind of went through it, and the fantastic amount of detail, as a consultant, I was just kind of counting up the consultant hours and thinking, you guys must have made a fortune out of this. And you're going to have to do it all again next year when all those jobs change. Because, jobs change very quickly, don't they? I mean, especially in particular sectors and in the current environment, they're changing really quickly.
Yes, there's a continual flux, absolutely. If you have some sort of framework, such as a job role framework or a global role framework, you have to accept the fact that it's going to be a never-ending process, because jobs change, technologies change, mergers and acquisitions occur. So, if you're working in an organization, suddenly you acquire another organization and you've got a whole different range of job roles, and you have to redo your taxonomy. And it just is. And in fact, and I'm sure my colleagues wouldn't mind me saying this, but when I was at Reuters, we were involved in a huge exercise with external consultants doing this. And at one point, I had 17 of my L&D team working on mapping job roles and skills, general and professional skills, to job roles, and then looking at what sort of formal learning solutions would support those. And it's overwhelming, to be honest. And it really was achieving, to be honest, the outputs didn't justify the inputs in that case. So I think that obsession around skills mapping and so on is a problem for us. It's, as I say, I wouldn't put it under the carpet and say we don't need to think about this. It's something we should be aware of, but putting all our time, effort and resources into just thinking about skills, we're going to leave a whole range of other opportunities on the table, which will give us potentially more value for the organization.
And it's pretty critical, isn't it, as well? Because we hear that it's, technology, investments in technology are supposed to result in better efficiency and better productivity. And at the moment, a lot of the stats seem to say that they don't, that we're not getting that productivity boost from technology that we used to get. So maybe people ought to be looking at kind of leaner and meaner, maybe, dare I say, AI-driven solutions that actually kind of pay back a bit better for rather than throwing human billable hours at problems like that. Anyway, in some ways, this conversation for me is a part two to the last one. Because as I say, I listened to it, and at least some of the questions I have result directly from things you said in that first interview. And at the end of it, I said, you've just raised so many questions, I haven't got time to ask you. Well, now I've got time to ask them. For instance, you said back there that people tend to see problems in their organizations as a lack of knowledge and skills rather than looking at the problem systemically. You cite Gary Rumler's remark that 98% of performance gaps are caused by organisational barriers, not by knowledge deficits. It might be a bit much to expect that things have moved on that much in the 3 years since we last spoke, but do you see any hopeful signs in your work with organisations that we might be getting there, might be getting better at thinking systemically rather than seeing everything as a knowledge gap?
Well, some organisations are certainly adopting a more holistic approach to their L&D activities. But as I've said earlier, there's still an obsession with knowledge and skills in the L&D work. And to a certain extent, I think that's understandable because, we've all been to school and college where we've been led through the process of cramming a curriculum into our heads and being tested on whether we can retain it for a while, or maybe not so much in primary education these days, but cramming information or knowledge into heads and testing to see if it stayed there is still the modus operandi for a lot of secondary and tertiary education, and that's sort of leaked over into L&D practices without thinking too much about the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And so, in my view, a lot of L&D is still just adult schooling, and where I see it changing is when L&D can adopt a performance mindset, so where traditional learning approaches are just part of the mix. And when we have a performance mindset, we start asking questions about the best ways to solve problems or how to take advantage of opportunities. And we really start with the desired business outcomes or the desired organization outcomes. Then we identify the critical tasks which are required to deliver those outcomes, and importantly, the other factors that might be influencing or be involved in any way. And you mentioned Rumler. Well, Gary Rumler and Alan Brash and others identified those other factors, things such as process clarity, good leadership, the right tools, the working environment, clear guidance, things like that. What W. Edwards Deming called the system. They identified those as being really, really important in terms of the percentage of impact that they are likely to have in terms of inhibiting or facilitating performance improvement. And so knowledge and skills might be part of the mix, but they're really the major barriers to organizations performing well. And actually Deming, when he reviewed every 10 years, he took a step back and thought about, and reflected on what were the greatest opportunities or challenges, what was responsible for fixing the greatest challenges or taking the greatest opportunities. And at the end of his career, he was very precise. Deming said that around 94% was due to what he called the system, which is the responsibility of management. That's in whether we have the right tools, the right leadership, the right processes, all that environment, those environmental factors. And around 6% is what he calls special, in other words, the performer. So I think things are improving in the L&D world, and people are seeing their work more as part of a continuous improvement process rather than some sort of set of content-based events for them to create, develop and deliver. And learning leaders are working more closely with their stakeholders. Maybe they're not co-creating solutions yet, but at least thinking more about performance outcomes rather than seeing learning to an end in itself. And I worked with a large international organization about a decade ago, and I remember being briefed before I went to run a workshop in Italy with this organization, and I was told that I wasn't to mention performance because this was a learning event. And it was a learning workshop for learning leaders throughout this large international organization. And I wasn't to mention performance. And I said, well, I don't think there's any point in me really coming. And then we had a discussion, and we agreed that I would mention performance. But I don't think that approach is so prevalent nowadays. I think most L&D people appreciate that what we do is aimed at delivering improved performance, whatever level that may be in the organization.
The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. That's quite astonishing that they would say that to you. And maybe things are getting better. I've spent a bit of time with performance people, learning the flow work people this year, like Bob Moshe and Alfred Remetz and so on. And it's really kind of inspiring to see some of the things that are happening in that space with AI. We've got a case study coming later in this season, something in a medical context, performance support through AI. Is this an area, do you think, where we're kind of waiting for the technology to get to the point where it really does the things that we know that we need to do with performance support? I mean, this has been a kind of theme in our world since the 90s.
I don't think we're just waiting for the technology. I think we're waiting for the mindset change. The performance support or digital coaches, whatever we call them, they've always been seen as a sideline in the learning development toolkit, rather than being front and center. And actually, we've had the technology and tools to deliver this and support learning in the flow of work for years. And the technology is obviously getting better with mobile devices and AI and driven systems and so on, obviously improving. But I don't think that's what's been holding us back. I think what's been holding us back is this learning mindset, this idea that we conflate learning with schooling, learning with training, and we can conflate learning with some sort of structured process. I get often asked about, often get asked around 70-20-10, how do we create a 70-20-10 program? And the answer to that is, well, if you're thinking of this as a programmatic mindset, if you think you're creating some sort of structured learning and that's going to include all of the elements of 70-20-10, you're probably coming in from, well, you certainly are coming in from the wrong way.
Yeah.
We can support that learning which occurs in the workplace. And performance support, way back from since Gloria Geary, we've known that there are really good ways to do that. But that's been held back, I think, by this. It's been held back by a number of things, but prime among those things has been this schooling mindset that we must manage and control the learning process, because we're the only ones who know how to define a curriculum and how to carry out instructional design and so on.
It does seem to be your work centres a lot on that kind of, the interface between technological change and mindset change, because it seems to come up so often in the things that you're saying that, there needs to be a mindset change, and you're one of the people who's instrumental in changing that. It's interesting. You also spoke the last time, well, you spoke earlier in this interview actually, about the need to move from focus on the individual to focusing on teams. There is a trend that we see in technology towards ultra-personalization now. And if you look at the way that social media platforms, and especially like the new generation, kind of TikTok and Reels and so on, work, it's becoming more and more ultra-personalized, and people have long wanted to kind of harness that for learning. But is that a trend that kind of militates against any sort of proper focus on teams and collective social learning?
I don't think it's an either or, John. I've been thinking about this for a number of years, and my reading on the L&D focus on individuals stems from the close link between HR and L&D, and also you just talked about this schooling mindset. If you think about HR leaders, what they're really focused on, they historically, I mean, you and I, there was sort of an age when HR was probably called personnel, when we were focused on HR by its nature tends to be focused on individuals. Of course, there are exceptions where we have HR business partners working with teams and so on. But basically, if we think about the HR worldview, where HR is involved on recruiting individuals and onboarding individuals, they may onboard them as groups, but they're thinking of them as individuals. Individual career development, individuals' behaviors, diversity, equality, inclusion, individual compliance. So the HR modus operandi is very much focused around individuals. And I think out of that has been generated, the whole idea has been pushed of competencies and competency frameworks and skills, because we're mapping individuals and individual skills and job role frameworks. And on the flip side, I guess, or a competing priority, as I describe it, for L&D to deal with, is what senior business leaders are focused on, or senior organizational leaders. And their focus is on not necessarily on individuals, but on functional teams in the organization. So if you talk to a business leader, they're not really so focused on the fact that John or Charles are delivering XYZ or are competent or skilled in whatever area. They're interested in what is this team producing in terms of quality, process improvement, customer service, speed to delivery, whatever it might be. And so there's a real challenge there between those two sort of ways of thinking. And so my thinking around this is that L&D needs to think more about the team, which is, in terms of organizations, the team is really the atomic unit of delivery. I can think of very few people in organizations who don't rely on anyone else in order to deliver and do their work and deliver what they're expected to deliver. And I think so we have this separation of ideas where senior business leaders are focused on teams, and they're also focused on expertise, because you're looking for your team to have a good balance of expertise. You're not looking just at general competencies, you're looking at task execution, you're looking at sort of systemic capabilities. It's not just the people, it's making sure the processes and the tools are right and everything there. And so I think that's a whole different world to the world that L&D has been in, or to a large extent still is, in terms of individuals. Now, as I said, I don't think it's necessarily an either or, because technology can help us do both. I mean, we can deliver ultra personalization, absolutely. But if we do it within the context of the fact that people are working in teams, the team is the unit of delivery, the unit of operation, it will help L&D to think about what we do in a much better way, in a way which is much more aligned with our organization's objectives. And I also think one of the other small bugbears I have is a lot of discussion around learning culture, which is, when we think about learning culture, very often we think about behaviors, engagement, and sort of formal learning services. Often you hear people saying, we've got a great learning culture, we offer all these learning offerings to our workforce. Whereas I would prefer to think of what we're trying to do is create a culture of continuous improvement. So we're thinking about how do we continually support people to do things better and support teams to deliver high quality, faster, or whatever the metric you might be using. And again, it's sort of overlaying all of this is this moving from the learning mindset to the performance mindset. I mean, learning is an assumption. We as humans are a learning species. So we need to step above that and think about, okay, what are we doing to contribute the value to our organizations, whether that is, in a government organization where we're looking at high levels of customer service and supporting the people that the populations that we're responsible for and so on, or whether it's in a commercial organization where we might be looking for high levels of innovation and agility and uh, delivery of service and so on. It really doesn't matter what, but I think there is a real balancing act for L&D to do in terms of meeting the requirements of HR to an extent, but not doing that exclusively without thinking about meeting the requirements of people who are leading other parts of the business. Because if we get tied down into the HR side of the business, we end up being an engine for compliance training and diversity training and all those sorts of things, which need to be done, but they can't be 100% of what we do.
Once again, there's a lot in there to unpack. I'd like to ask about what reflection is that, kind of team building falls into a certain box in the traditional training mindset, wasn't it? Okay, let's get, captain of England rugby to come in and address people about the team, or let's just have a day at the races together and, get the beers in and, and there we go. But you seem to be saying it needs a lot more sophisticated focus than that. Then another reflection really is about the nature of social media, which is, I'm obviously as a kind of marketing media person, I'm very interested in. There is a contradictory thing within it, that it is ultra personalized, that, that kind of TikTok knows what you're interested in just by looking at you. You don't have to like anything. It just knows what you like because of the way it works. So it is a kind of the peak of ultra personalization at the moment. On the other hand, it's a social medium, somewhat obviously. And it seems to me that there is something in that a kind of maybe that paradox or the way those two things come together that is worth kind of thinking about for learning people.
Yes, I agree with that. I think that, but with some caveats. I think that when you, and I've been a heavy, I would say heavy social media user for years, and I've also been involved in collaborative learning for many years, and so I think that social media does offer us some really good models in terms of how we can build communities. The positive side of social media, where you build supportive communities and you generate new ideas and you expand people's thinking and so on through social media, and having technology which can actually track and see what you're doing and so on, with all the caveats in terms of personal privacy and so on, is, I think, do offer real opportunities. And I think there are some learning technologies which do this, but not a lot. Hopefully an increasing number of learning technologies which use these social elements to really help drive organizations forward. And again, it comes back to this idea that we're working in teams. And I remember working some years ago with a large French organization that their model was purely formal learning, and they decided to move to much more sharing experiences and reflection, and they had a big program called One Learning a Day, where people were encouraged at the end of the day just to share their learning with their team. And they had they developed an app which did that, and had a huge impact in terms of the culture and the way that people work together. And we've all seen that. We've seen where just a conversation will spark ideas and help you in your own endeavors, in maybe on a project that you're working on, just having a conversation or reading a conversation with through other people. So I think social media has a really, really important role to play in learning, and I don't think we exploit it enough, to be honest.
Of course, it is worth acknowledging that it's a difficult area for learning people and for HR people, of course, generally, is that dangers associated with social media. You mentioned privacy and other things, and I wonder if digital addiction doesn't get to be more of an issue as we go on, because some of these, the short form video forms like TikTok and so on are very tapped into the addictive sides of human nature that make them very difficult to put down. You know, you pick up your phone to check what the weather's going to be like, and then 2 hours later, you say, where do those 2 hours go? Oh yes, I was on TikTok. Terrible stuff. Anyway, just to change the subject slightly, you're chairing an event in London this October that I'll be attending and hope to be reporting from. That's the plan. Learning Futures from Iventive, sponsor. Can you give us a taster of what topics you hope the events will cover and what messages you'll be giving to attendees at that conference? I should say this isn't just bigging up the sponsor. Iventive have a really interesting model where it's more participative than a normal conference and not quite the kind of speed dating event that a lot of these paid conferences are for. So I know we both think it's kind of an interesting venture. So what can we expect from that conference?
Well, I've been involved with Iventive events for many years now. In fact, since they started running them I chaired the first one in 2009. And the way I see them is that they're a great way to keep up with leading edge practice. As you mentioned, they're called Learning Futures for a reason. They're sort of looking to the future and thinking about how we all get there. But they're very much around sharing. They're very much around exchange and discussion. And it often includes input from researchers and professors in learning. In fact, the one in London, the Dean of Executive Education at HEC in France, she's going to have a session talking about women in innovation and diverse leadership and other things. But the model of Iventive is around bringing people together and sharing their experiences and challenges and successes and learning from each other. And so the 2 days in London will certainly cover, lots of top of mind issues. There'll be, I know that one of the participants, eBay, is bringing together the whole challenge around collaboration across teams. There's leadership development issues, of course, looking at different ways of redefining learning culture and a range of other things. So, as you say, they're not a sort of a matching service in any way. They're simply around getting a group of senior learning and talent people together to share their ideas and to generate and co-create potential solutions that people can take back to their organizations. And, if I were asked to give a message to people at that conference, which I will be giving, it's really around, use this opportunity to try and test different approaches and to innovate yourself whilst you're there, and to get ahead of the game, because by sharing, hearing what other people are doing, and talking to other folks, that's really one of the best things you can do. And I sort of often go back to my former colleague Jay Cross, who always said he wrote that learning is learning is. I can see you're crossing yourself there, John.
For the tape there, I'm making the sign of the cross. Yeah, good old Jay.
Yes. Wonderful.
Sign of the cross. That didn't occur to me. Actually.
Yes, very appropriate. But Jay wrote that learning, that conversation is the stem cell of learning, and I hold that dear. And these Iventive events are very much around rich conversations and sharing experiences. So for people who are going to be there, I never come away from an Iventive event without having learned something or being challenged in my thinking. They're really, it's really good open conversations.
So apart from AI, which is obviously very much on people's minds, in terms of learning futures, what do you expect or suspect might come up at that event?
Well, you can never really guess, because sometimes people bring a real challenge that they're absolutely up against the wall with, and time is spent looking at how we can, how the collective can suggest ways of addressing it. So it really could be anything. I can tell you one thing for sure. Learning technologies is going to be the heart of that, and there will be lots of discussion about practical application of AI and applications of other sorts of technologies and so on. That'll certainly be a thread that'll run through all of these, in fact. So it's an opportunity just for people to step away and step up and think strategically about what they're doing, what they might do better, what ideas they can glean from others, and really just spend 2 days immersed in that. And we all know, the challenges of when you're in the flow of work in daily work. It's quite difficult to step back and take a bit of time to reflect and share and hear what other people are doing.
So lastly, where do you look to for information and inspiration yourself nowadays? Are there any new people coming up or focal points that have captured your attention recently?
Yeah, I listen to a lot of podcasts, when I'm walking or gardening or driving, although I tend to stick to political podcasts in the car where I can shout and not be heard. But I do enjoy learning podcasts. The Learning Hack goes without saying. And I find that they're really good to stimulate thinking and challenge my worldview. And the other places I look to, really, I also read quite a bit, but most of the reading which has influenced me over the past few years has been from economists and scientists. And I think economists have really understood the link between learning and doing for years. And a couple I'd recommend and always recommend, first of all, Joseph Stiglitz wrote a wonderful book called Creating a Learning Society. It's a bit heavy on economic modeling, but Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize winner and really knows about continuous improvement. And these economists are often looking at macro levels, which we can apply down into our organizations. And Stiglitz says, we learn how to produce more efficiently by producing, which is sort of obvious to anyone. In other words, practice and experience are what drives improvement. So Stiglitz is one. Another economist who's really influenced me is Kenneth Arrow, who was a Stanford University professor for years. And in fact, Stiglitz and 5 other Nobel Prize winners were also all students of Arrow, who also won a Nobel Prize for economics. And Arrow published a long paper back in the early 1960s, which I still refer to pretty regularly, when he had a post at Oxford University. And the paper was titled The Economic Implications of Learning by Doing. And I mean, the title says it all, really. And I think that's really well worth a read. So I've learned a lot from that. But other than podcasts and reading, to my point earlier about Jay Cross, conversations are really important for me to keep up and get some sort of inspiration and thinking. And I'm towards the end of my career now, but I still see that there's a lot of very interesting things that are happening. And I think that, conversations are the stem cells of learning, as Jay said. So I have conversations, not every day, but almost every day with different people, thinking about, how we can improve what we do in our profession. And, there will always be real opportunities for change. And the whole technological revolution that we're living through is making it far more interesting and far more complex than it used to be. It used to be about how I used to refer to it in a very derogatory way of saying perfecting the irrelevant. How can we make this course a bit better? Well, actually, fine, that's a great aspiration to have, but there's a whole lot more that we can do other than that. So that's basically how I spend my time.
Marvellous answer. Talking of economists, we might also want to mention Daniel Kahneman, who, of course, is much cited in the learning world and got his Nobel Prize for economics, interestingly enough. possibly because there isn't a Nobel Prize for Psychology. And on the subject of conversations, this has been a fascinating one for me, and I hope a valuable one for all the listeners. I'm sure they will. We will have a report back on that event you're chairing. But for now, thank you very much. And I'm going to go home and think about a load of other questions for the next time we meet. Thank you very much, Charles.
Thank you very much, John. I look forward to seeing you in London.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to our guest and to our sponsors.
The Learning Hack is among the top 5% most listened to podcasts globally, according to Listen Notes, we found out. But it depends for its existence solely on sponsorship and your Patreon contributions. If you want us to continue holding these excellent conversations about learning, it's you who said they're excellent, not us. Let's have a chat about your company sponsoring. Or sign up to patreon.com/learninghack. For a piddlingly small amount of money, get transcripts, text summaries, and early access. Keep us alive. Until next time.
Stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.